Everybody wants the lights to come on, but not many people want an energy generating site near them.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the America First Energy Podcast. My name is Skyler Zunk, and I'm your host for today's very special episode. Back in my student days at Washington and Lee University, I started out pre-med thinking I'd become a doctor one day, but politics pulled me in and quickly. I craved connecting those big classroom ideas and theories to what was actually unfolding out there and trying to become a thoughtful voice on local, state, and even national stuff, all from a fresh student's perspective. In class, we'd often be tasked with writing persuasive essays on one topic or another, but outside of a learning tool, I felt like opinions were worth sharing more broadly. My professors nudged me to maybe submit an editorial to the local paper at the time and place, the Roanoke Times, to see if they'd pick it up. So I did, and on several occasions, I sent those editorials to Dwayne Yancey's inbox at the Roanoke Times, the editorial editor at the time. Each of those pieces took me hours across several days to fine tune. Be hunched over a desk, editing out every extra word until I had an eloquent, punchy, and persuasive opinion packed into 700 words or less. I mention this story because I think it underscores the skill, deep knowledge, and expertise that Mr. Yancey has because he makes it look easy. Dwayne is an editorial juggernaut. He cranks out several pieces weekly for the Cardinal News now, and he's one of Virginia's sharpest commentators on politics and culture. As our audience knows well, so much of our work at Energy Right and the America First Energy Project focuses on engaging in rural localities where a couple dozen votes decide a board of supervisors race, and a board vote can decide the fate of $1 billion energy investment. Local government is closest to the people. It's the most tangible, but it isn't always flashy. It's frequently newsworthy, but not always accessible. What happens in Richmond and Washington certainly do matter, but what happens at the county boardrooms affects our homes, the schools we send our children to, and the roads we travel to get there. And as Virginia considers more energy generation than ever before, and we also consider more energy users than ever before, the Commonwealth is simultaneously trying to lower our dependence on other states to meet our own energy needs. I am so happy today to be joined by Mr. Dwayne Yancey of the Cardinal News to join us on today's program. Dwayne founded the Cardinal News back in 2021, co-founded, and is now the editorial director for Cardinal News. And Cardinal News is such a valuable piece of a newsmaking organization for our team and so many Virginians across South Side and Southwestern Virginia. Dwayne, thanks for coming on today. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be here, and I'll have to call you Dr. Zunk because now you're a doctor of public opinion.
Maybe there'll be a Dr. Zunk one day, but I think it's going to be my sister and not me. Um, Dwayne, you've written so many pieces across the past couple of years at an increasing pace about where Virginia sits in our energy grid and our energy future. If you could sum it up succinctly for our audience, where is Virginia? What are some of the biggest challenges from where you sit?
The biggest challenge is that Virginia has more data centers than any other state. Those are concentrated in the D.C. suburbs, Northern Virginia as we call it, but they are spreading out into other parts of the state. They require energy. At the same time, Virginia is under the Virginia Clean Economy Act. This was passed in 2021, I believe, and it mandates a carbon-free electric grid for the state's two biggest utilities. So on the one hand, Virginia is under a mandate to switch to non-carbon forms of energy, which in Virginia primarily means solar. We have no onshore wind. We do have some offshore wind coming, but in Virginia, when we talk about renewables, we're basically talking solar. So we have that going on. Then we have this huge demand ramping up, and that is creating enormous pressure on rural areas to host, energy sites. And energy is political, and so there are big political fights over energy. Everyone agrees we need more of it. We can fuss and fight about what kinds we prefer. But as I like to point out to people, everybody wants the lights to come on, but not many people want an energy generating site near them. So that's That's the trick right there.
Yeah, Dwayne, we see that so much in our work at the county level across Southside, really across the entire state, but increasingly down in Southwest Virginia as well. These boards are grappling with these big decisions to permit solar projects, battery projects, and some of them are even flirting with small modular nuclear reactors at this point. You've been in the business quite a while. Has anything in your view of Virginia history over the past several decades caused boards to grapple with such big decisions at such a frequent speed? Has there been anything this big or controversial that boards have had to grapple with?
If so, I sure can't remember it. Um, local, the members of local boards of supervisors, are not elected on these issues. Um, these are much higher technical kind of thing than your board of supervisor is usually tasked with. In most localities, the single biggest expense of county government's the school system, and so you often find schools and school spending to be the big issue, and and taxes and zoning, very important issues locally, but that is what these local boards are set up to do. And suddenly they're being asked to weigh in on energy generation, and they are not equipped for that, pro or con. um a lot of these boards, a lot of these local governments, are very thinly staffed. The county administrator doubles as the economic development director, and the public safety manager, and lots of other things. And so, this is just sort of, beyond their skill level. I don't mean that
And
in a
Dwayne, do you hear
disparaging way.
that?
That's just what they're for.
Do you hear that from boards and county administrators themselves? I mean, I know these certainly are big controversial issues, but some simultaneously feel that they're not equipped for these big decisions. But folks also want these local siting and zoning decisions to be kept at the local level. And we'll get into this later, but both candidates for governor here in Virginia this year have also said that they don't want to strip away local control, which supposedly could as a Dillon rule state. But do you think that they simultaneously feel like they're not equipped for it, but still want to maintain that authority locally?
Oh, absolutely. The one thing that will unite local governments anywhere is to suggest that any power be taken away and given to Richmond. You can find the most fractious board in the state. You suggest that, and suddenly they are unanimous. But it's a big issue, and slightly off topic but related, are data centers. And in my county, Bogota County, which is a rural county, but it's not the most rural of localities. It's just outside Roanoke, so it's got some structure to the government. They recently landed a Google data center, um, and the county administrator there basically spent a year. That was like his main job. He basically delegated the running of the county to one of his deputies because the details of that project, were just so complicated and so enormous that, he felt he needed to give that his main attention. Um, yeah, in that county, he had other staff he could, delegate to. In a smaller county, you wouldn't have that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point you raised there, Dwayne. I read your article on the Bogota proposed Google data center, and I believe one of the members of the board said that it might be the biggest thing since the railroad came through. Gosh, over 100 years ago, and you
Oh,
went into it quite analytically, and looked at other peer localities that are host to these data centers, and there aren't terribly many of them. Um, do you think the county's still pretty up on that decision?
the county officials are.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure about the general public. Um, and that's not to suggest they're in opposition. They're just less informed. Now, that was sort of an easy decision in Bogota because the data center is going into an industrial park. So, this was land that had been set aside for development, so you did not have the issue of taking, prime farmland and converting it to something else. Uh,
Yeah. Dwayne, I totally agree that a lot of these counties don't feel prepared or have these big outstanding questions relating to energy development. And as you mentioned earlier, it is the name of the game in Virginia right now is solar and some battery storage. But I think our team has noticed uh, a difference in how localities will consider energy projects based on that own locality's history with other forms of generation or or energy extraction. I mean, it's far Southwest Virginia. Terry Kilgore's neck of the woods really understands energy and the economic effects that energy generation can have from the coal days, and they understand it and are, permitting smaller sites at a very healthy pace. Folks just understand energy. They want more investment. But you'll go to some areas in Southside, which have never mined coal or extracted gas or anything, and they're considering energy for the very first time ever. Learning about the grid, learning about interconnection, learning about the economic benefits and certainly some drawbacks to energy development as well. Have you noticed any of that with localities that have had a longer, more storied history with energy versus some that are really fresh to it?
well, I was going to ask you what your impression was. I was going to turn the tables a bit. So that's fascinating. You would know that better, but I would not disagree with any of that. Because we've certainly seen differences. You can't just talk about rural Virginia feeling one way. One county might feel very differently from another. And if you're seeing, localities in, far southwest coal country be more receptive, that makes perfectly good sense. They've also got, lots of, you know, coal mining lands or, former coal mines that, can be repurposed. So again, it's not the issue of taking, farmland out of production, which is, always a, sore point no matter what the kind of development is. Um, you probably also don't have housing developments there right beside some of those places. So, there's probably a better place in terms of, less friction. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
far southwest, they have sort of, I guess, emotionally tried to reconfigure themselves. They've long thought of themselves as a coal capital. Well, coal is, obviously on the downhill slide. And so they've tried to reposition themselves as well. Really, we're an energy production center. Um, and so, they have seen solar as part of that. Um, they've, looked at a small nuclear site. They've looked at, hydroelectric. They've looked at various forms of energy under the theory that, well, yeah, coal is our expertise, but, really, energy is what we know about. Um, Whereas, yeah, you're right. In parts of the South Side, which was, farming country, particularly tobacco, energy is, you know, that's a brand new thing. And we all
What's
know
the
how
side?
people react to new things, usually poorly.
Well, I want to dive into that, and I think you're exactly right. Change in rural anywhere, change just generally is uncomfortable for folks, and they have to grapple with it. But South Side over the past 100 years or so has seen several different waves of changes, and one could argue we might be in the middle of one now. South Side had tobacco; that was their cash crop. Tobacco was king for so long. And that's still present there, but a smaller and smaller portion of Southside's economy year after year. We saw textiles boom in Southside Virginia, folks making things, and then folks would argue that NAFTA caused a lot of that to go offshore, and a lot of Southside localities are depressed. I think a lot of them are coming back. And then we're seeing energy now, and I think some folks see energy as just a passing fad. It's going to be here for 10 years and then it'll leave Southside high and dry again. Do you think that's an accurate characterization? Do you think that's what folks are keeping in the back of their mind when they're considering some of these investments?
I don't know, but because, Yeah, an energy production site is not going to move to China, the way a factory might. The forms of energy might change, but it's not going to be, offshore in that kind of way. I would say, one thing to keep in mind, State Senator Bill Stanley, Republican legislator from Franklin County, often gives a very dramatic speech, and he will give this very, much better than I will. Yeah, you go back 100 years, and Southside Virginia was the industrial center of Virginia. Places like Danville and Martinsville were some of the most affluent communities in the state, because of things like textile, furniture, tobacco. Well, all of those have gone away. And now Southside is not the most affluent part of the state. It's often one of the poorest parts of the state. So there's been this great economic trauma that has been visited across both South Side and Southwest with coal, where the pillars of their economy have just collapsed. And we could talk all day about the reasons why, but the fact is they have. Um, so I'm getting kind of philosophical, I guess, but there's a lot of those communities feel that they have had a wrong done to them, and therefore might be skeptical of having a wrong done again, regardless of what it is. On the other hand, may be very open to, hey, will this be, what will bring us back? Um, and it will be
Yeah,
very interesting to see how data centers play into this. And of course, there's a big overlap between, data centers and energy. Um, Microsoft has a big data center complex in Mecklenburg County on the North Carolina line, um, that has been economically great for Mecklenburg. They built a new high school based on the tax revenue from that. There aren't many rural localities that can build a new high school without having to raise taxes, and Mecklenburg did that. I'm not sure where their power is coming from, but we're moving to a day where if you want a data center, you're probably going to have some energy generation connected with it.
that's interesting, Dwayne. And certainly Mecklenburg's very happy with Microsoft, and you know, I think probably would want more of it. It's been a huge boon to the locality, and it's spreading some of that data center economic benefit down from Data Center Alley up in Loudoun down to Bodoc County, Mecklenburg County. We can name a dozen counties that would do a backflip to see a data center proposed there. But that energy conversation, I'm glad you tie it to that. You have to have that power, has to come from somewhere. And increasingly, you're seeing an appetite for not always, but an appetite for data centers, but not an appetite for new energy generation to power it. And that's kind of where the rub is. It's like you can't have the
Yeah,
best of both worlds necessarily. It's got to be a balance, but it's a hard one to strike.
yeah. I mean, because Mecklenburg is now sort of turned against solar, um, you know, but they like their data center. Um,
Yeah,
so we all want the lights to come on, but we don't want the power generate. We don't want the power plant next door.
yeah. Well, Dwayne, you've paid very close attention to several governors' administrations now at this point, and my overall question is, what do you think Governor Youngkin's energy legacy is going to be? Because I think it remains to be seen in so many ways. Our first guest on the program was Director of the Energy Department, Mr. Glenn Davis, several months
Hmm.
ago. Fascinating guy doing phenomenal work on behalf of Virginia's energy grid.
Yeah,
I call to mind that the offshore wind project, huge for Hampton Roads. A lot of folks, the Republican member of Congress are happy about it. It's billions of dollars invested, and a lot of those local Hampton Roads businesses are getting a chunk of that, and hundreds and hundreds of jobs. But those talks started 10, 15 years ago, probably back during the McConnell administration, and they're just coming on now. So much
yeah,
of what Governor Youngkin's pushing for is advanced nuclear, small modular reactors, turn to natural gas, while certainly being an all of the above energy governor, supporting supporting the offshore wind project, supporting the investment in solar in the Commonwealth as well. How do you think he'll be remembered, when folks call to mind his energy plan?
Sure. Before I answer that, sort of let me declare where I sit. And, Cardinal covers, Southwest and South side. So, certainly aware of the offshore wind project, but that is, not really ours. So, if I were in Hampton Roads, my answer might start with offshore wind. And my understanding is his administration has made it clear to the, to an anti-wind White House that, this is a good thing. From where we sit out here in the western part of the state, I would say that the governor's energy legacy is going to be nuclear. Now, he's going to leave office without a single small modular reactor, under construction, but that's not his fault. That's just how long those things take. But he has probably done more than anybody else in Virginia to raise the profile of small modular reactors and sort of introduce them into the public conversation. They might have, I'm sure they would have happened anyway, just, the way the market is going, but he has been the one to really elevate their profile. And right now we have, one talked about for Dominion at their North Anna plant, maybe at the Yorktown Naval Weapons Station. Appalachian Power is looking into one at their Joshua Falls substation in Campbell County outside Lynchburg. There is much chatter about them, and I think that you can trace that back to the governor with his megaphone.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is certainly led on it and excited a lot of investment. And I think it's a feat to get both utilities on board with these advanced nuclear sites. I remember earlier in the administration, the focus was put squarely on Southwest Virginia. I think the legislative delegation was very happy about it. And then I'd be curious on your perspective here, because you probably covered it and paid closer attention to it than I did. Folks, think about energy, like you mentioned earlier. It's a great thing in abstract. There's nothing wrong with the solar panel. It's great to have natural gas as a base load generator. Nuclear at Lake Anna or Surrey is phenomenal until it comes to your own community. And solar is getting the brunt of that right now with the not in my backyard folks who
Yeah.
love the idea of it but don't want to site it. And that came to a head in Southwest Virginia with some essentially anti-nuclear sentiment cropping up, folks not wanting to um, see these investments take place in Southwest. Tell us a little bit about what you saw there.
Sure. You described it very accurately there. There is a group of you know anti-nuclear activists who are very the Southwest Virginia Nuclear Watch, I believe, is the name of the group that is formed. Um, so what you had were public officials, state legislators, local government officials, very much in favor of the idea of small modular reactors, and then you had a group of activists who were not. Now, I'm sure there are things going on that I do not know. As a journalist, I hate that, but I have to acknowledge that there are things going on I don't know. Um, I don't think utilities ever had really much interest in that. Um, it was very telling to me that when Dominion Energy, proposed a small modular reactor, it was at their existing nuclear power station in, North Anna, um, which, I don't see how anybody can object to that. I mean, there are already two big conventional reactors there, Yeah, another one is not going to make that much of a difference. You've also got technical issues like transmission lines. So, while I'm not privy to all of Dominion's thinking, I'm sure Dominion is looking at, the path of least resistance. And well, here's a site we've got, there's room, there's transmission lines, we've got the security, we've got the workforce. Why do we need to go replicate all that and have, some controversy in some other part of the state? you know, when we can do it right here. Um, likewise, it was interesting when Appalachian proposed theirs. It was outside Lynchburg, a nuclear community. You've got BWX, you've got Framingham there, so there's a lot of understanding in the Lynchburg community about nuclear. And when Appalachian had their first public meeting, forum, whatever you want to call it, about that, the main complaint that people had was not about the nuclear facility or the proposed nuclear facility. It was about whether the boat ramp to the river was going to be closed. Uh, so I think both of those utilities picked, you know, places where that will not generate much opposition. Um, and I completely, I get that. Um,
Yeah. Dwayne, we run a
the
poll every
question.
year. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, the question will come after, somewhere down the line, assuming SMR is developed the way, people think they will. And we've done all the quote easy sites, and we get to other places. How will Southwest Virginia feel then? Um,
Yeah, we run a poll every year where we ask Virginians, if there was 100 acres near your home, what would your preferred land use be for that? Would it be a small scale solar farm on that 100 acres? Would it be a gas plant? Would it be an industrial park, housing, or small scale nuclear? I mean, solar wins out, with the majority. Then it ticks down there, and SMRs, I think are just going to be this large siting issue for these localities once you use up those easy sites like you mentioned, but something so important and something I don't think many folks are paying attention to. Energy siting is difficult no matter the form. There's demonstrating that every single week in county boardrooms across the
yeah,
Commonwealth. But I'll be up in a community this evening that denied all solar last year, that now has a 1.5 gigawatt gas plant that's coming in to utilize up that capacity, and that's not a walk in the park either.
yeah,
I want to get into the VCA here shortly, but whether we keep the VCA, alter it, there's still going to be this siting challenge to meet this crazy energy demand that we're seeing, and it's not going to be easy no matter the form.
well, yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, if you know, even if the VCA disappeared tomorrow, people are still going to be upset about X next door. Whatever X
Mhm.
is.
Yeah. Well, John, you mentioned VCA passed in 2020, and the Governor Youngkin's administration has been working since 2022 to correct what they think is some of its excesses and to move forward with baseload generation while also bringing on cleaner renewable sources. There seems to be some talk in the General Assembly that the VCA was designed for 2% annual load growth, not the 6.5% that we're seeing year after year. A lot's going to be left up to this next governor, whether it's Abigail Spanberger or Winsome Sears. You did a really interesting interview with both of those and read your reporting on it. As we mentioned from the top, neither are on board for reallocating siting control to the state. I think that's definitely a safe position to be in. How would you characterize some of their differences, and what do you think the path forward is if Sears or Spanberger become governor? Because both are going to inherit this large energy challenge that Governor Youngkin's working on right now.
Sure, that to me that is sort of, I won't say the hidden issue because we're talking about it. It can't be too hidden. That's the big issue that the candidates are not really talking about unless they have to. Because it doesn't make it easily on the bumper stickers. Whoever wins is going to have to deal with that. We need more energy. We need electric rates to go down. All of that. The main difference, Spanberger is much more pro solar than Earl Sears is. Um, Earl Sears says she's not against solar, but she is very skeptical of whether solar and battery storage can do the job. Spanberger is much more enthusiastic about that. Um, Also wants to see a lot more distributed solar. She's talked about, parking lot canopies and, that on buildings and that kind of thing. So I think if, she were elected, we see a push there. But it's notable, um, sort of what they're not saying, or, yeah. Spanberger allows, we're going to have natural gas and we're going to have biomass. Um, there are some Democrats out there who like to shut down natural gas. She's not one of those. Earl Sears is not saying, we're going to shut down all wind and solar. Just, that's not her preferred means.
Mhm.
Um, so I think, both of them are living in the realm of reality there. They've got
Yeah.
different preferences, but, you know,
How much of a
uh,
shift do you think that represents on Spanberger's part? With VCA passing under Ralph Northam's administration, with every Democrat essentially voting for it, essentially outlawing or phasing out natural gas as well, and Spanberger, coming to the table and saying that it's going to be a part of our energy future, and we need to recognize that. Do you think that's a market shift? Do you think that's just the demand growth that we're seeing as expedient way to meet that?
yes. And I can chatter on more about that, but I remember, I think it was the night Northam won the primary. There were some natural gas protesters who, tried to get up on stage with him because they felt he was too sympathetic, to natural gas. We're not seeing that now. I mean, I'm sure those protesters are still out there somewhere. But I've heard from a lot of Democrats, um, they will talk more privately than publicly, of course, who say, yeah, we got to change the VCA. Um, they would change it in ways different than ways Republicans would change it. But I haven't heard anyone say, no, it's, we need to keep it absolutely the way it is. And I've heard, some Democrats, again, privately say, if they win and, keep control of the General Assembly and, have a Democratic governor, that the big fight is really going to be between some Democrats and environmental groups. Um, that in their view, environmental groups just want to shut down data centers, and you know that's their how they would deal with energy issues, and some of these Democrats are saying that's not realistic. There are regulations we need and all that, but we're gonna have data centers. We need data centers. We need the energy to go with it. They kind of get silent when you ask them, well, what does that mean? And even speaking privately, they're not inclined to go there. But I think they're going to be much more open to natural gas. Um, you know, there's already a split among Democrats on nuclear. Um, some who have come to see that there's no way to achieve green energy goals without nuclear. And others who remain, splitting atoms is, a bad thing. Um, but again, it's notable, Spanberger, so I mean, she's pro SMR. Um, you know, Earl Sears may be a little bit more enthusiastic, but that may just be sort of a tonal difference. Um, so if Democrats win, that's where the action will be. Is the Clean
Democrats against
Economy Act is going to
themselves.
be rewritten. If Republicans win, I don't know what will happen because you will still have a Democratic state Senate. So, at least for the next 2 years. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. Dwayne, if there's any, I know you're not in the business of giving advice, but if as these leaders are considering considering their energy plans, considering what energy is going to look like through a lens of what rural Virginia is experiencing, playing host to the vast majority of these projects that require land, require access to transmission lines. Is there any Is there any advice that you'd give as they're considering these difficult issues, trying to balance the demand that we're seeing in these more urban areas and folks in Richmond just seeing the more rural areas as the areas for the supply of this energy?
Um, I will say some things, whether it's advice or not, we'll we'll see. Couple things. One, a former county attorney for one rural county, I heard him speak at an energy conference. Um, I think one of your people was there too, and he talked about how many county supervisors, really know very little about solar energy and regard it as voodoo energy because they don't understand. They just don't understand it. Again, they weren't elected on they didn't run for office with an energy platform. They ran, for office on a platform of keeping taxes low and, you know, either for or against that rezoning on the corner, that kind of thing. Um, so, one, you know, whatever you're pushing, help people understand the technology because people, do not naturally know all of this. Um, More politically, there's sort of growing resentment in some quarters of rural Virginia that, wait a minute, we didn't ask for this. How come we have to shoulder the load for Northern Virginia? They want the power for their data centers, let them produce it. So I think people need to see, what's in it for them, and, I'm by no means an electrical engineer, so I'm about to, venture well beyond my level of expertise. Are there, is there a way to provide, free power to the school system, you know, as, part of the deal? Well, then, okay, then, people understand that if, that means, reducing the school's electric bills by, whatever percent. But, yeah, that would be sort of my general advice. The other thing, in some places, um, energy company now are still dealing with some of the mistakes that previous ones made. Um, and I'm thinking of one county in particular that had no solar. Solar company came in, proposed some solar sites, hugely controversial, big split on the county board. County board eventually voted 3-2 in favor. Some of those supervisors really went out on a political limb, recognized the advantages, voted for it. After they voted for it, the energy company pulled out because they found out that the local substation couldn't take the power they were going to produce. Well, you would have thought they'd have checked that out beforehand. So now the mood, I'm told by the county administrator there, the mood in that county is very anti-solar. Yeah, even though they voted for solar because, well, this company came in and, told us all this and, caused all this commotion and, then they couldn't do it.
No, the
So
county.
you still have to know the politics and history of each county. Next county over may have a completely different story.
Yeah, it's a patchwork and it's difficult to navigate, but I really appreciated your point in education and answering the questions that these folks have. They're in these positions for the first time, deciding on something didn't see themselves having to decide on. They have to be quick studies, ultimately trust their instincts, but do their very best to make the hard long-term decision that's going to benefit their locality the most. Um, Joanne, I can't thank you enough for coming on and for all of your work and your team's work at Cardinal News. When you started out, you had a staff of 3, and I think you're up to 16 at last check. Keeping folks informed across Southside and Southwest Virginia that don't have the quality or quantity of local newspapers that they can rely on for a lot of this news and analysis. So thanks for coming on. I have one
Yeah,
final question to go
sure.
ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's been a wild ride, because we started to fill a void in the news ecosystem. What we didn't count on were how quickly newspapers are going to collapse. Um, and we blew past our 5-year goals in 18 months. So we're off into uncharted territory. I'll just point out, we're also a nonprofit, so we're out
You
there,
are.
shaking rattling the tin cup every day.
And how can people donate if they feel so led?
Go to cardinalnews.org and click the donate button. And
It's
we have
that
a
easy.
daily newsletter you can sign up for. It's free. We have no paywall. Everything is free, but we hope you'll leave us a few pennies.
Well, Dwayne, I certainly enjoy your Friday political wrap up every week. It clues me in on what I missed happening in Richmond and beyond. So that's another added benefit. Dwayne, we wrap
Yeah,
up
that's
each
what
of
we have
our.
6 newsletters in all, so that's one of them.
It's great. We wrap up all of our interviews with guests with one kind of fun question, and I know you're going to have a great answer. But if you could have dinner with anybody, alive or past, anybody in the world, just to pick their brain, maybe get some quotes on background or on the record, who would you sit down and have dinner with?
It would be I'd have to flip a coin between Thomas Jefferson and William Shakespeare. Um, you know, Jefferson just because he was a politician and involved in so many things. Shakespeare, involved in fewer things, but so many of his words survive. I would like to know where some of his phrases came from. But yeah, I'm
I
in
knew
Virginia. You can't go wrong with citing Thomas Jefferson in Virginia.
you sure can. I knew you were going to say Shakespeare because I don't think many folks realize you're a playwright as well.
Yeah,
But that certainly would make for an interesting dinner conversation.
and I do believe Shakespeare is Shakespeare. I don't think he was an imposter. I think he was the real deal.
Well, in my politics classes, it was required reading to read through a few Shakespeare plays, and I think there's certainly some lessons that we can garner from those old works to today.
I mean, he was, I mean, this is hardly an original thought. I mean, he was a political analyst. He just did in different forms. He was a propagandist, for the Tudors against, the Plantagenets. So he certainly, he either had political views or he knew what was, uh, yeah, appropriate for the times. He understood the political winds. So,
Excellent. Well, Dwayne, thank you again. We'll have to do another episode when you can let us know what William Shakespeare would have said about our energy challenges here in Virginia. Can't thank you enough for joining us, and can't thank you enough for your hard work on behalf of Southside and Southwest Virginia at the Cardinal Times, or Cardinal News, excuse me. Thank you, Dwayne.
well, Shakespeare had a lot of quotes about the sun and wind, so I'm sure there's a lot there. Nuclear, I think he was silent on, but
Probably. Thanks, Dwayne. Well, thank you again to Dwayne Yancey, founding editor of Cardinal News, for joining us this week on the America First Energy podcast. I really enjoyed that conversation on a personal and professional level. What Dwayne and his team at Cardinal News do from day to day to day, covering the news that isn't covered enough down in Southside and Southwestern Virginia, is extremely valuable. We certainly appreciate all of his work and his team's work in the energy space as well, which is a vexing issue for so much of rural Virginia. Ben, I know you get quite a lot of Cardinal News coverage down in your neck of the woods. What did you think about it?
Yeah, no, I think it's great. In an era where local media is sometimes lacking, and we don't have stories coming out of our local communities. It's great to have a group like the Cardinal News team tell stories from all across Southwest and Southside Virginia. As far as Lee County, all the way down near Tennessee, up to the border of Kentucky and West Virginia, all the way over, of course, to Southside Virginia. It's always great to have folks that are willing to be on the ground and on the beat, hearing from local folks, especially when it comes to energy. Like you say, it's a hyper local issue here in Virginia where if you're not really paying attention, if you're not in the room sometimes, or if there's not a reporter there in the room like those from Cardinal News telling those stories, sometimes important issues can fall to the wayside. So it's super important that the work they're doing, and of course we deeply appreciate Dwayne's willingness to chat and explore obviously political and energy issues from across Virginia. But Skyler, I'll throw it back to you
Yeah.
for a couple more thoughts there.
Absolutely. Well, Dwayne got at this during our interview. Is just that energy is such a huge part of what they're covering day to day. Seeing these large proposals come into Southside, Southwest Virginia, from energy to transmission to you name it. We actually talked a little bit about the Governor Youngkin's energy legacy and his leadership on nuclear, which came up recently in the gubernatorial debate between Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears and challenger Abigail Spanberger as they're vying for an election coming up here next week on November 4th. Abigail Spanberger was asked if there's one thing that she really appreciated from Governor Youngkin's time in office, what would that be? And she answered his advanced nuclear policy, really supporting nuclear investments here in Virginia to help meet that incredible energy demand that we're seeing. Michael Pope of Virginia Public Media put out a little story about this, just kind of noting how unique and how interesting and newsworthy it is for both candidates for governor this go round, supporting nuclear investments here in Virginia. And that's not always been the case. I mean, we haven't seen new nuclear come online in quite a long time. Of course, we have Commonwealth Fusion Systems down in Chesterfield that we're very hopeful for with some experimental technology coming on. But that's news in and of itself. I mean, whoever we have for governor for the next 4 years is going to be a supporter of nuclear energy as part of the mix to meet our incredible energy demand. It's also interesting in that it inherently calls for some adjustment to the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which was passed in 2020 and is not terribly friendly for new nuclear investments in the targets that it sets for our utility providers. So that in and of itself is pretty striking. Glad to see that, hopefully we'll have some of Governor Youngkin's energy legacy pay off in the next 4+ years as we see some of these new nuclear sites come online. Ben, what were your
Yeah.
top line messages out of that story?
Well, I think it's interesting for anybody who watched the gubernatorial debate. Of course, it was a fiery debate with very little agreement. And so, to your point, I think it's very important that we unpack just how central, obviously, the energy conversation is, but this agreement here is to kind of the future of our state's energy portfolio. Of course, we've been tooting the horn that Governor Youngkin's been tooting as well over the last few years, which is we've got to have an all the above approach. I think, you mentioned the VCEA. Of course, the policy was drafted in an era where data centers had not proliferated and our demand had not been growing. But talk to anybody. We've had energy director Glenn Davis on the podcast, of course, who makes it pretty clear as well. We've got to readjust. I mean, and good policy is active policy, is fluid policy, is changing policy. And you make it clear, of course, you noted it, the VCEA outlined solar and storage targets for AEP and Dominion are to investor-owned utilities here in Virginia. But nuclear, you heard it from Abigail Spanberger, you've heard it from Winsome Earl Sears. Nuclear, natural gas is going to be a part of the equation, and if it's not, we're in pretty bad shape. So it's going to take that mix. It's going to take a combination of what can come online now and what we can build toward in the future. To solve our energy problems. Of course, we'll be the first to tell people, despite how important it is to support nuclear, it's also important to make sure you're supporting all of that energy that we can bring online, which of course includes renewables as well. And I think it's that we're moving toward a point where we can find some agreement between the two camps where we're going to have, hopefully coming out of the election, regardless of what happens, a real true commitment in 2025 and beyond, or 2026 rather, and beyond, a true commitment to that all the above energy approach, which honestly is the only way that we can have a reliable grid, have a cost-effective grid, and that's something that I think anybody with common sense is getting behind.
Yeah, maybe on a future episode, once we know what the results of the election are, we should talk about what the Virginia Clean Economy Act's history has been and what policy changes have been, attempted to change the VCEA and some of its metrics and timeline. Governor Youngkin has session after session after session attempted to bring Democrats to the table to adjust the Virginia Clean Economy Act to account for that incredible load growth that we are seeing now that we weren't seeing back when the VCEA was written. And Democrats have said, no, 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 we're keeping it, we're keeping it, we're keeping it. But I think implicit in Abigail's support of nuclear and her support of keeping gas plants online uh, longer is this need to adjust the Virginia Clean Economy Act somehow, some way. And you got to the important point, Ben, about it's not only the state policy that matters for the utilities, but it's also the permitting and siting policies across Virginia's 95 counties that really matter to this. So I think there's room for, of course, this energy reform to broaden the Virginia Clean Economy Act, make us more competitive with that all of the above approach, support new nuclear investments and more investments into quickly deployable clean energy solutions like solar and storage. But it's going to be a big, big question, maybe this coming session with the incoming governor, or maybe in the session taking place in 2027, to come together to really look at what we're doing well with as an energy grid and what we're failing to do. And a huge piece of that is that 40% of energy that we're piping in from other states within the PJM territory. So our listeners will be quite familiar with that, with the coverage we did on PJM and our energy deficit over this past summer. But we've got some changes coming to Virginia's energy portfolio, no matter who wins. We're going to see more nuclear. We're going to see more electrons being added to the grid in the way of solar storage technologies. Or are we going to continue down this untenable path where we're importing a growing number of electrons from our neighboring states to satisfy our own economic growth?
Yeah, and I think it's important that we highlight, and I think we've made this clear in past episodes too, but it's easy for us to think of this kind of as a zero sum game, that the conversation sometimes falls into this, well, it has to be clean energy or renewables, it has to be nuclear, it has to be natural gas, it has to be coal, right? You hear all these arguments for different types of energy sources, and it begins to sound like only one source of energy can prevail. And unfortunately, of course, the Virginia Clean Economy Act didn't make that any better, right? Effectively picking a winner out of energy sources. So the situation we have now is to make clear that this is not a zero sum game. This is a positive sum game. We've got to collect as much energy as we possibly can, or rather energy generation sources, get them online and get them producing energy, both to address our importing, increase our energy security as we face we're heading into a winter here that is likely to be pretty chilly. I know over on my side of the state there's going to be a good bit of snow this year, or at least that's what there's forecasting. And having a resilient energy system means having a lot of energy generation, and that means we've got to have solar and battery in the short term. It means we've got to commit to those offshore wind projects that are developed. Dominion's got that big project that's going to support the eastern side of the state. We've got a wind project onshore here in Botetourt County. We're going to potentially have more natural gas in other parts of the state. Building out infrastructure for that, we've got to invest in these new generation technologies so that we can be more resilient, more secure, and overall, in the long term, by having that more of that generation, more storage to support the energy grid, we save money for consumers, whether it's a large energy user and business that's generating a lot of tax revenue, or it's a homeowner. By having more energy, I mean, it's in many ways it shouldn't simplify it too much, but in many ways it is pretty simple. It's a supply and demand issue. We just don't have enough supply right now, and it is truly, we need to start thinking about this more comprehensively. And I think we're seeing a little bit more of this. This story is a little bit of a shining light about maybe we are starting to think more comprehensively and not in that zero sum type game. But we've got to continue to tell the story that this is a positive sum issue. We need as much energy generation as possible, for sure.
Yeah. Well, one thing's clear, the 75th governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia is going to have to walk the walk on energy, not just talk the talk, but really put into place comprehensive policy reforms to get an all of the above strategy, both in policy for our utilities, but also permitted, built on the ground when they're actually doing what matters, creating electricity. Ben, thanks for joining us today for in the news segment. And thanks again to Dwayne Yancey of the Cardinal News. Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the America First Energy Podcast.
Thanks, Skyler.